Hi everyone, seeing that it's just about the top of the hour, we're going to go ahead and get started. As always, we're going to start off with just some basic ground rules. Hi everyone, seeing that it's just about the top of the hour, we're going to go ahead and get started. Alrighty, sorry about that, I had some echo, got that I was resolving there. I hope everyone's had a good quarantine conference so far. I hope everyone got some food and some coffee. Just as you, I have a kind of a weird little setup going on right now. I have my computer sitting on a couple of books, and apologies for the little fall you saw right there. Okay. Just as always, sorry for those that have been here since the beginning and how many times you've heard this talk, but for those just joining us, want to go over a few things. This is a virtual conference, and none of us are per se tech experts, and so we are at the mercy of the technology here. If something gives out, please be patient with us and we'll try to get it back online as soon as possible. Please be respectful of the presenters here. They did their very best to get all this wrapped up for us in like a span of 2 weeks, sometimes some even fewer than that. And we do feel like sometimes we as humans feel like we can hide behind the background of the screen. We can hide our face and be a little more anonymous. That being said, please remember that these are real people with real feelings and doing their very best to just share information with you. Also, just as a live conference, we encourage you to network and engage with each other. So you can go ahead and if you're using the Zoom app to talk to us and watch this whole thing, you can interact on the chat function. You can also go to YouTube, use the live stream chat function there. And also on both Twitter and LinkedIn, we are using the hashtag QVIC2020. And we've had plenty of good content there so far, so we would love for you to go ahead and add to it. Alrighty. Our next presenter is Reg Baker. He is the North American Regional Ambassador at ESOMAR, and he will be talking to us about data privacy in this weird time. All right, and with that, Reg, I'll go ahead and let you start.
Okay, can you see my screen? Can you see my screen? Hello? Hello?
Reg, I believe your mic might not be going.
No, it's fine.
Oh,
Not muted. We okay now?
Reg, I believe your mic might not be going.
No, I don't think so. I'm not on mute. So you can't hear me?
We can hear you now.
You can hear me now.
Yes,
okay.
sir. We're just not seeing your screen share.
Okay. All right. So let me share my screen. Okay. Do you have it now?
Perfect.
Perfect. I wouldn't say that. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining, and thanks for coming in to listen. I'm afraid I'm one of those people who has to hide behind the screen today because even though I have been pretty much virtual since I retired from full-time employment in 2012. For whatever reason here in this time of crisis for all of us, my camera has decided it's not working very well. So I apologize for that. What I wanted to start by saying today is that I decided to do this presentation in part because I've become alarmed at how much of our personal data is being sucked up from each of us every time we go online, and then how it's being used. But also because I think it's been fascinating to watch the degree to which personal data has been brought into play out of, whether it's out of fear or whether it's out of this desire to understand more clearly just how the pandemic is spreading. But we're seeing not only increased use of personal data for those purposes, but at the same time, because now we're all going virtual, we're all spending all this time online, the rate at which personal data is being collected is at a all-time high. But before I go, I just want to get into the details. I just want to make sure that everybody understands who ESOMAR is. For those of you who don't know us, we're the only truly global association for market research in data analytics. We have over 6,000 members worldwide and in 130 different countries. Normally, we put on something like 70 local or global events around the globe every year, but like everyone else, we're finding that our events increasingly this year have all been virtual. Our value proposition to members is built around the whole concept of advocacy for the profession and for the sector as a whole. And you can check us out at www.esomar.org. And if you choose to go there, please be sure to have a look at our COVID-19 pages, where you will learn a lot more about how the global insights community is dealing with this pandemic that we currently are all suffering through. Now, let's start with this bold statement. I expect most of us would agree that we are now at a point where, for all intent and purposes, privacy, at least in the online world, is dead. What I hope to talk about here is then the way in which the COVID-19 pandemic has both dramatically increased the amount of personal data being collected and accelerating its use beyond typically what we're used to, which is its purposes for advertising and marketing. This is a reality that should not surprise any of us. This quote is from a book published in, it's either 2000 or 2001, I forget which sort of lays out kind of what the future looked like at that point in time. And I'm going to read it to you. The future we're rushing towards isn't one where every move is watched and recorded by some all-knowing big brother. It is instead a future of 100 big brothers that constantly watch and interrupt our daily lives. George Orwell thought that the communist system represented the ultimate threat to individual liberty. Over the next 50 years, we will see new kinds of threats to privacy that don't find their roots in totalitarianism, but in capitalism, the free market, advanced technology, and the unbridled exchange of electronic information. So I think you read that and you have to say, yeah, it was very prescient. And the part that Simpson got wrong was that it would take 50 years, because it's really pretty much taken only about 2 decades. Because we're now in a world where, for better or for worse, technology is everywhere. It's omnipresent. It's an important part of our daily lives. The most obvious example of that is the fact that there are now more mobile connections than there are people in the world. And these charts always fascinate me. I love them. They get produced from time to time. What happens in an internet minute, which tells a lot about how this technology is being used. And you can go through and you can look at this stuff, and it runs from the sublime to the ridiculous. So it's very clear. It's showing what we buy, who we buy it from. It's how we spend our time, what we watch on TV, what apps we use, what software we use. I mean, it goes on, and you can look at this and you can see the degree to which it's possible for any one individual, construct almost a diary of what their lives look like. And then more recently, a book which is getting a lot of press and is really is really a fascinating read, even though it's a doorstopper, as one critic called it, being 750 pages. But this notion of surveillance capitalism, which is what was about in the previous quote that I read to you. But Shoshana Zuboff is a academic at Harvard, has written a number of books about technology. And she, I don't think, invented the phrase surveillance capitalism, but as she calls it, it's the unilateral claiming of private human experience. The chat box is in the way, so I can't read it to you. As free raw material for translation into behavioral data. Now, this should sound very familiar to all of us in this session here today. These data are then computed and packaged as prediction products and sold into behavioral futures markets. That being business customers with a commercial interest in knowing what we will do soon, now, sooner, and later. Now, the part that's particularly chilling for me is this next part, that right from the start at Google, it was understood that users were unlikely to agree to this unilateral claiming of their experience and its translation into behavior data. It was understood that these methods had to be undetectable. If we were in a room, I would ask for a show of hands as to how many people find that as alarming as I do, and as a way to look at what's really happening. I often am amazed, for example, that Chrome is the most popular browser on the internet. It's free. It comes from an advertising company. Why in God's name would we continually expose ourselves to it on an everyday basis? So in a very short period of time, we have gone from this, which used to be one of my very favorite cartoons about the internet, to this. And the span between these two cartoons is about 25 years. Okay, so how do Americans feel about all this? And this is I just find it very intriguing. This is from a Pew study that was done in 2019. You can read it as I can, but it's just amazing. So the percent of U.S. adults who say all or most of what they do online is tracked by companies. Okay, so that's almost 3/4, 3 out of 4 people. They are very or somewhat concerned about their personal data is used by companies, 80%, okay? Almost 60% admitting that they understand very little or nothing about what companies do with that data, right? And a mere 18% admit to having some control over their data. And then the benefit that people get from it is really so limited, 28%, and a whopping 81% saying the potential risks outweigh the benefits. The question this immediately begs is, then why do people go online? And this is something which I'm not going to get into, but which a lot of people call the privacy paradox. On the one hand, people want to protect their privacy. They don't want to deliberately share all their personal data that they share when they go online, but they go online nonetheless. So here's some more Pew data. And the point of this is just to show who people trust in terms of who they're concerned about having their data. And social media sites, of course, are right at the top of the list, as are advertisers and the company that people buy things from. There are a number of studies that's been done by the Global Research Business Network globally that looks at who people trust with their data. And wave after wave of those surveys show that people do not trust, or they trust social media the least. Advertisers are also close to who they do not trust. But indeed, those are the people who mostly have the data that's so concerning to folks. So, okay, so this is going on out there. We all know what's going on. Nobody's surprised by probably anything that I've shown on the screen at this point in time. And along comes this pandemic, and it's kicked both the collection and the use of personal data into overdrive. And I want to look at two areas. One is what we're doing here, right? That's the whole rush to online caused by social distancing requirements and the need to continue to be productive, to work virtually, to stay in touch with our families, with our friends, and in general to try to do the best we can to have something that approaches a normal life. And the other thing is the increased uses of location data in the fight of the pandemic. Now, here are some headlines that you see coming across your screen from time to time, which talk about this enormous rush that's happened in terms of people going online and doing things that they've not necessarily done in the past, people flocking to social media, search engines in massive numbers, setting into all these expanded virtual interactions. And what this means is that Facebook, Google, and all the cloud-based communication platforms that are supporting the virtual meetings, the happy hours, are learning more about us at a faster rate and with more granularity than ever before. And as we just looked at the Pew data, we do this even though survey after survey shows that of all online services we use, social media networks we trust the least. So these headlines sort of give us a good sense of what's going on. There's an upside to all this, I should say, in that despite this crush, the internet has held up extremely well. There's a real argument that there have been some productivity improvements that are result, particularly of us virtually. I think when we get to the other side of the pandemic, the way in which we work is probably going to be changed forever. So these are all positive things. But on balance, the amount of information we're sharing is especially problematic. And when you look at this little graph on the screen here, this I grabbed from Twitter, and I think actually the guy who posted it was a physician of all things, who is alarmed because he sees that his screen time is up 185% from last week. And when you look down at the bottom to see how that's time being spent, his productivity time is about the same as others, and social networking is over the top. So this is sort of the kind of world that we're living in now, as we cling to these tools as a way to continue to keep in touch with the world outside of our own homes. I feel a little badly about this slide because I'm on Zoom and hopefully the link doesn't get severed, but this is a good example, Zoom, of kind of what's happened in terms of these virtual interactions. You can see Zoom's been around for a while, not all that impressive. These data, I should add, are from a website called Similar Web that tracks website visits. And then suddenly, as we've gotten into social distancing, use is off the charts. Now, the part I hesitate to say is that Zoom is not without its problems, particularly in areas of security. They're currently being sued for having sold personal data to Facebook. Hacking into Zoom calls, as we all know, the famous Zoom bombing has become a thing. Their website's been hacked, and personal conversations and data has been stolen. One privacy expert that I happened to stumble upon reviewed the Zoom privacy policy and has described it as a bucket of red flags. And now we're beginning to see a number of companies actually prohibiting its use. And in fact, even the US Senate has come out against using Zoom because of concerns about privacy violations and poor data protection practices. Now, I read also that the CEO of Zoom is aware of these problems, that there's an article in Business Week this week, for example, that says no one is more surprised than he is about the level of traffic that they're experiencing. But it's an example I point out here, not because of their privacy issues so much as to say that, look at this kind of dramatic increase in use of this kind of technology, even though there are these privacy concerns. So let's switch here away from all this data that's now being collected as we've all become more and more virtual, and talk about the use of mobile location data. You know, there's a bullet at the top of the screen that says a willingness to trade privacy to fight the pandemic. And, you know, just when I went on and I was looking at the presentation, I thought to myself, I'm not sure this really is a willingness. You know, I'm not sure anybody was asked whether we could use their personal data to go ahead and fight the pandemic. But I don't hear a whole lot of objections about it happening. It is fascinating to watch how various countries have gone ahead and glommed onto it. US, China, South Korea, Singapore, Germany, Israel, Poland, and many countries are all in. Now, I should say that, you know, there are some very legitimate uses of it in which data is basically held anonymous. There was an interesting, for example, article in the New York Times a week or so ago, which showed that while that there was a real socioeconomic bias in terms of social distancing, and that people at the top end were finding it possible to stick to their homes and to not have to go out, while people at the lower ends with jobs that didn't afford that kind of freedom were still having to go out into the world and do work and expose themselves to the virus. So that's an interesting kind of policy issue that usually this data brings up. But, you know, it's become a bit scarier than that. A friend of mine in the UK, a colleague actually at ESOMAR, sent me this cartoon on the right, which appeared in the Sunday Times, I guess, this past week. And I thought it was just kind of cute, etc. So I poked it in here. And then I read later, there are actually instances of the British police going out and scaring picnickers away for violation of social distancing policies. Scarier still are things I read that, for example, in China, where this data is being used very extensively, when they detect crowds forming that shouldn't be forming, they send out drones to scare everybody away. So this is really kind of frightening surveillance that's possible once you really tune into to this data. And increasingly, it's finding its way not just into people who might be processing it for health-related reasons, but also governments. Israeli government, for example, is making broad use of it. And there's also this process of, you know, how you establish contacts when someone is diagnosed. And one favorite tactic is to go to credit card receipts. So that one can see exactly where someone went, who they might have interacted with. And but scariest of all from my point of view is the tagging of people based on their disease status and their location. And examples, for example, in the UK of a company that has an app that will buzz you if you get close to someone who has been diagnosed with the disease. So there's a lot of real issues buried in here. You could say these are mostly good things, which are really helping us to halt the advance of the pandemic. But they're also, one has to admit, some pretty serious violations of privacy. And if you go to the US in particular, a lot of people are now worried that we are going to see the same kinds of legislation that we saw after 9/11 in the form of something like the Patriot Act applied now to health status. And so, for example, this headline from the National Review saying Kushner considering using personal patient data to create a national coronavirus surveillance system. It's kind of a scary thought, at least to me, that the government maybe have possession of my health dossier and may even be, for example, you know, having biometric data on my phone that for whatever purpose they may think is an honorable purpose, still represents, you know, a pretty profound violation of our personal freedoms. So the important thing here to remember, I believe, is that the privacy risks are more than simply targeted marketing. It's not just, that we all start our day by going into our email and getting rid of all of the ads that came in overnight and all of the spam. It's a much bigger problem than that. And here are 4 areas in particular. And this especially becomes an issue as we rely more and more on artificial intelligence, which these data streams feed, and other means of making automated decisions. So they include, for example, loss of opportunity in employment access, insurance, other benefits, housing, education, all places where you have to apply for something, and based on some review, you may or may not be welcomed into that club. Economic loss is, of course, a concern. Granting of credit, mortgages, even pricing of goods and services can be discriminatory, and general narrowing of choice. Social detriment, emotional duress, public embarrassment. Should there be information about you that that somehow becomes public, whether you're a member of some group that gets stigmatized in some way, or simply the whole problem of the selected advertising. And of course, there's always the possibility of that these data can be used as part of court proceedings that result in loss of liberty, incarceration in the worst case. So there's lots of ways in which these data in the wrong hands can be very problematic. So, okay. Dark story you may or may not agree with, but I think we all have to kind of look at this issue of once the pandemic is over, how do we get this genie back in the bottle? Friend of mine, same one who sent me the cartoon actually, sent me a piece from the Sunday Times a few weeks ago in which a columnist theorized what the world would be like if big tech used all of its power and all the information, all the resources it has for good instead of for other kinds of things, and how this could make a much better society for us. I personally think that's probably not going to happen. I think there's too much money in what's being done at the moment. And so the challenge before us is how do we ensure that as the pandemic eases, that we can somehow get these new tools put back in the drawer. Now, as citizens, as well as brands and researchers, we really need to insist on stronger regulation of the collection, especially the use of personal data. In the US, which is, here's some more Pew data, you can see there's strong support for that across party lines. But with the exception of a few individual states, and for reasons we are all painfully aware, progress has been slow. And it's not just these Pew data. In the Zuboff book, she looks at 48 surveys that conducted over several years that all talked about the desirability for enhanced privacy protection, and finds that there's lots of support for that in 46 of those 48 surveys. Companies themselves are concerned. So this data happens to be from a study that ESOMAR did with Cadence, and the respondents here were IT, research, marketing, and advertising execs in 3 countries: the US, the UK, and India. So this is this is the business people. This is not individuals who are worried about their own privacy being compromised. And so 2 points on this graph strike me. The top line: businesses share share data too freely with third parties. 2/3 of people agreeing with that. And then at the very bottom, 91% saying that there should be a minimum standard level of data protection in all countries. I should have noted that there are 3 countries here: US, UK, and India. The data in this chart here is just for the US. So, big tech will resist, and they are resisting any and all attempts to kind of bring all this under control. They are not going to suddenly become a force for good. As I said, there was too much money at stake, and you know, even very large fines of the sort that we see coming out of the EU all the time are not a deterrent. These companies have deep pockets. They just pay the fines. They keep on trucking until their behavior is normalized. We need to find more fundamental ways to strike at the heart of their business if we're going to change their behavior. I'm not going to hypothesize on what those might be. Simply note that fines have shown that they're ineffective. So I want to shift. I mean, what I've been talking about here is mostly about sort of societal concerns, and want to get down to the concerns which we all have, whether we're data collectors as brands or we're doing it as MR companies. How do we succeed in an environment where people feel like their personal data is under assault and that they are more and more, or I should say less and less, inclined to respond to requests that we put in front of them to share that data with us? And I think for this, I think we have two options. I think option A is really to refresh and recommit to the historical values of this profession, which are strongly rooted in privacy, in anonymity, and protection of personal data. And one way to do that is to commit to this whole philosophy of privacy by design. And the essence of privacy design is to always have privacy as a default setting as we design our data collections, and to always put the privacy and interests of the individual as the first priority. And that's true whether we're doing, you know, face-to-face data collection, online surveys, whatever, or even, you know, in the course of processing everything that falls under that heading of big data. We really know kind of how to do this with surveys that we do. We know we need to be transparent about the information we collect, its purpose, whom we're going to share it with, and in what form. That's kind of routine for us, I think, it should be, in terms of the consent process that we've been used to for many, many years. But now there's this market out there for buying personal data and rich profiles, maybe not with exactly the variables we want, but nonetheless, you know, very attractive stuff. And, you know, one of the problems with that is, while there are a lot of legitimate sources for this data, a lot of it is dubiously sourced, by which I mean that people have no idea that it's being collected on them. And so one of the things I think the responsibilities we have in respect for individuals is not to use those kinds of sources. We also, however, under the privacy design concept, have to make sure that when we're using that kind of, say, big data resource, whether it's social media data or whether it's, you know, something that in terms of customer files, clients provide to us, that we're managing it in such a way as to mitigate the impacts on individuals. Transparency is really the key element of this, at least when we're talking about direct collection from people via surveys or focus groups or whatever. Here's another study. This one ESOMAR did in conjunction with a company called HERE, which is an EU company that does a lot of work with location data, particularly for the auto industry in Europe. And in two sort of interesting answers in the course of that survey. The percent of participants who say they are likely to share their data if the data collector is clear about why the information is needed and how it will be used. 70% of people saying they're more likely to do that if that sort of information is provided to them. And what's really interesting is that they strongly agree they are more likely to buy or use the services of companies that handle personal data as they should. And while you might look at that and say, okay, 33% is not a huge number, it's interesting that when you look at less developed countries, this would happen to be a study across 10 markets. 52% of respondents in Brazil said they're more likely to buy from a company that handles their data fairly, and 60% in China. So this is a really strong argument, it seems to me, for us, indicating that respect for people's personal data, promising to protect it, and indeed following through on that promises can be an important feature of how we interact with people in the course of doing research. But there's an option B, right? And unfortunately, there are companies in our sector which seem to be following it. And that is to follow the lead of the advertisers. The first draft of this presentation, I talked about a bargain with the devil, but that seems a bit extreme. But the reality is that the industry is going through something of a transition. There is a strong belief, for example, that behavioral data is much more reliable than what we're accustomed to in terms of opinions and attitudes, intents, things of that sort. And so when you talk about behavioral data, that's a kind of path that often leads to all those things we put under that general heading of big data. And many people argue that big data is the new paradigm. And that really puts us in many ways, potentially at least, into the same kinds of data collection and analysis procedures, methods that are used by advertisers. And another element of the whole advertising world is opposition to robust privacy practices, and always presenting them as an hindrance to doing business, costing the economy, millions and millions of dollars. And, that's a kind of position that I think does not serve us well as an industry, but it certainly is something that we see working itself out, across the globe as country after country after country does take up the challenge of trying to have more effective privacy practices. So, okay, so to sum up, the quote, which some of you may recognize, is actually from the old CASRO code. Maybe you may remember CASRO before it merged with the MRA to form the Insights Association. This notion needs to be updated because we're not just talking about research participants anymore. It's hard to say where someone who, when a company collects data on one of its customers, that person is a research participant. So you get into legalese like data subjects and things of that sort. But in general, it's still true, right? I mean, our business really is processing personal or collecting and processing personal data to help our clients make better decisions. And so whether that comes from participation and giving it up to us in the course of a survey or some other mechanism, they deserve the same level of respect and the same protections. So I think, there are 4 things that we need to be doing as an industry. First, I think we really need to establish the culture of self-regulation. I worry that we have lost that. And our ethics have fallen to whatever is legal, or worse yet, what clients may require for us to get business. There used to be this thing called the bright red line, which basically said we protected the identity of our respondents, even from clients, to prevent any kind of follow-up, say to deliver marketing messages or whatever. We need to rethink that and get back to that kind of protection. Secondly, all the signs point to the fact that the regulators have noticed that we're not the same industry we were 20 years ago. And so the kinds of exceptions we used to enjoy by virtue of being scientists rather than, for lack of a better phrase, enablers of intrusive marketing are harder and harder to come by. So it's more important than ever that we clearly distinguish what we do from what marketers and advertisers do. And third, I think, the professional associations and trade bodies, not just ESOMAR, but in countries around the world, must play an essential role, not simply to lobby on our behalf, the industry, but also to work with regulators to establish new regulatory frameworks that protect the rights of all the stakeholders. A phrase, for example, which is embedded in the GDPR in Europe is the notion of co-regulation, which implies the same partnership between regulators and industry, which is a way of recognizing the unique needs of individual industries. And finally, I think it's critical that the industry at large, between buyers and sellers, support association efforts in their enterprise through membership, through financial support, and working toward a common cause. I talked about some of these issues at the Quirks event in Brooklyn back, it seems like forever now, in early March. And someone from a brand asked me a question and said, should we simply be hiring companies who subscribe to an association professional code of ethics? And my response to that is, yeah. I mean, that's one way that a brand can support what we're trying to accomplish here. So, so that's what I have to say. And I guess now, if people have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Hi, Reg. It looks like we do have one question from Russ in the chat. It says, is there a code of ethics you can recommend?
Well, you know, I'm from ESOMAR, right? You go to the ESOMAR website, you can very easily find the ICC ESOMAR code, which details, at least at a principal level, what it is we should be paying attention to. And also one of the things that ESOMAR does on a regular basis is issue guidelines and standards, a whole family of guidelines and standards, in fact, that take that code and kind of translate it into research setting. So right now, we happen to be working on 3 major such documents. One is what we're calling something in primary data collection, which is those instances in which you actually interact with a research subject, a research participant, for example, to get consent. A second guideline on secondary data, which is the terminology that ESOMAR uses to describe all those things that fall under the heading of big data. And there the issues are much different in terms of establishing grounds for being able to ethically process a data set. Complicated stuff, which we're still thinking through. And we also have a guideline that hopefully will come out this summer on duty of care. The very first article in the ESOMAR code says that researchers have a duty of care to those whose data we use. And so it goes into some detail about how exactly to deliver on that premise. But the reality is there are lots of associations. And they all have codes, and many of them also are very consistent with what's in the ESOMAR code. So in the US, you have the Insights Association. If you happen to be from Canada, the CRIC, the Council, let's see, Canadian Research and Intelligence Council, I guess it is. They happen to use a slightly modified version of the ESOMAR code. Market Research Center in the UK has a terrific code. Associations all over the world have codes which kind of reflect what the situation is in individual countries.
Awesome. That was a well fleshed out answer. We also have another question from Victoria that says, when you say distinguish between what marketing researchers do versus what advertisers and marketers do, how can this effectively be done when much of the data is used / consumed by marketers and advertisers? Is an MR an enabler?
Yeah, that's, you know, this is the old story, right? Oh gosh, we don't, we sell the guns, but not the bullets, I guess is one cynical way to put it. You know, yeah, we're all using the same data. The question really becomes, from my point of view, is what are the impacts on the individuals whose data we're using? So for example, you know, in this drawn from what I'll call the old days, right, when all we did was surveys, we would do segmentation studies. Client would give us a sample of their clients, and we would go ahead and maybe do some additional interviewing. Then we would do the segmentation work, and we would pass back to the client, not those individuals whose data, you know, the records for those particular individuals, but we would pass back, you know, what for lack of a better term would be a typing tool. And the client would then go ahead and apply that typing tool to his or her entire customer base. Now, as a result of all that, someone who's in that sample might get a marketing message from that client. But they got that marketing message by virtue of being part of a demographic or attitudinal group, some segment They didn't get it as a result of having participated in a survey. So I think finding those ways to distinguish between the science of it, applying the tools, and providing guidance on how clients can do what they do better is distinct from building profiles of individuals and then selling those profiles to clients so that they can take direct action against them. That's the distinction that we're trying to make here. And that carries over into use of secondary data sources, where it's the data comes from someplace else. It may come from a customer's files. It may come from a social media site, whatever. The critical thing is that we're not delivering back to people information on individuals unless we ask if it's okay and we're clear about what it's going to be used for, and that client and that individual says, yeah, you can go ahead and do that. You can do that in the context of traditional survey research. You can't really do that when you're talking about big databases and various kinds of sources of big data. So your hands are a bit more tied in those particular instances.
Gotcha, makes sense. Great. I actually had a question of my own as well. So earlier today we had a panelist speak about a very interesting topic of neuro research and being able to judge more of like brainwaves and such to get information and data. And you mentioned earlier behavioral versus opinion-based. Are you worried at all, or should we be worried about how some paranoia about data sharing will affect the advancement of more biology-based research?
No, I don't think so. I saw that presentation. I thought it was really, really interesting. It all comes down to what are the impacts on an individual by virtue of his or her data being used in the course of a research project, okay? And how do we identify what the risks may be to that individual as a result and make sure that we mitigate those risks? One of the things that we have been espousing that companies should engage in on a regular basis is something called a privacy impact assessment, where you systematically look at the design of your project, how all the data is going to be handled, who are the subcontractors, all that stuff, et cetera. And you look for, where are the leaks, right? Where are the flashpoints where that data could be disclosed either intentionally or inadvertently, and make sure you put the proper measures in place so that doesn't happen. So, that's what we're trying to say here. It's pretty simple. We want, we're going to use all the same kinds of data in many ways that, the advertisers and others use. But it's really making sure that there are no consequences to the individuals involved for us having used that data.
Gotcha. Makes sense. And did we have any other questions? Alrighty then. Well, thank you so much, Reg, for your time.
Okay. And thank you. And thanks everybody for listening.
Great. And of course, Reg has his email right there. If you have any other questions that pop in your mind later on, you can reach out to him there. Also, we highly recommend reaching out on our different social networks. So if you reach out on Twitter or LinkedIn with the hashtag QVIC2020, and follow up with anything that spurts in your mind from this presentation. All right.
Thanks very much.
Great. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.